Hello there. Welcome back to Daddy Rolled a One. I'm Martin, and this is another in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons, and one of the companies that published them, Tactical Studies Rules, and its later descendant company, TSR Hobbies. Today, we're going to be talking about some obscure or forgotten classes that have been around since the dawn of Dungeons & Dragons. They were part of the home campaign of one of the game's co-creators, and yet they've never really made their way into official core classes for the game of D&D and any, like I said, official publications for the game. Before we get started, though, I would like to please ask you if you could like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so, and share my video on your social media networks to help me grow my channel. That is the quickest and fastest way for me to do so. Lastly, please go into the comments below and let me know what you liked or didn't like about this video. Also below, you'll find links where you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and also a way that you can support my channel by visiting my shop to buy a t-shirt, hoodie, poster, or mug featuring exclusive tabletop role-playing game designs that are only found at Daddy Rolled a One. So let's get started with this discussion of classes. So far, we've talked about the Thief class. We've had a whole video on the Thief, or Rogue if you prefer. We've talked about the history and origins of the Cleric, Paladin, Ranger, Illusionist, and Bard. Then we had a follow-up video where we talked about the Assassin, Monk, and Druid. We covered some of the newer classes that were available in later era first edition from Unearthed Arcana. There was the Barbarian, the Cavalier, and the Thief Acrobat. Now, we haven't talked about a whole slew of classes that came out in later years for the BOGGS edition of the game. If you're not familiar with that terminology, that acronym BOGGS, please see my video on the history of D&D editions. But there were a bunch of products that came out with new classes for that game. Most specifically, the Creature Crucible series that had a bunch of monster classes, and then also the Gazetteer series. There were others as well, but those are the two main ones that kind of came to mind when I was thinking about it. We also have not covered the characters from this book, 1985, Advanced D&D. There's a whole bunch of classes in here that reinterprets the environment of D&D away from the Western European inspirations into more of like a, to be very clear, pop culture sort of version of Asian type characters. It's not historical. It's not based on history. It's based on, again, pop culture, but there's all new character classes in here that do that. So we haven't talked about those, but I did want to talk about two classes that we first hear about, at least, as being character classes in this publication. This is First Fantasy Campaign, 1977, written by Dave Arneson, published by Judges Guild. Now, this is called First Fantasy Campaign. I've talked about this before, but this is Dave Arneson's Blackmoor campaign. So you see they mentioned Blackmoor here. They just don't mention it on the cover. But this product is basically his notes. So it's really, it's very note-based. I'll just put it that way. But in this book, at the end, there's a section on special interests. I talked about that on my video on skills. There's a link to that up here in the upper right-hand corner. But in the section on special interests, he lists the character types that exist in Blackmoor. Okay, so he's got Fighting Man, Cleric, and Magic User, which are the three ones that from original D&D, right? So Fighting Man, of course, is Fighter. Then he says Ranger and Paladin. So we know that Paladin came out in the Greyhawk supplements, where it first debuted an official publication for D&D by TSR, the Greyhawk supplement. That's early 1975. It might have even been January, I believe. Ranger is based on the Paladin class. It's a character class that was first published in Strategic Review magazine, and that's in the summer of 1975. But then he lists three more here at the end: Assassin, Merchant, and Sage. Well, we know the Assassins made it into Blackmoor Supplement 2, came out after Blackmoor, also 1975. However, the Merchant and Sage did not. So the Sage is in that book as an NPC. Merchants don't appear in there. So let's talk about that a little bit. What we're going to do in this video is talk about when these classes were created, who was the first person to play them, why they were created, and then when we can, discuss what the class was and what it could do. That's going to be the purpose of this whole video. Okay. So I'm going to divide it into two parts. I'm going to start with the Merchant, go through that class, and then I'm going to come back and discuss the Sage. However, I would like to ask you in the comments, let me know if you'd prefer that style of what I'm going to do here for future videos. Do you like these longer form videos, or would you have preferred that I had published it as two separate videos, one just on the Merchant and then one just on the Sage? The reason I didn't do that is because I didn't want to have to repeat a lot of the information, because a lot of it is going to apply to both. So We have original D&D. This is a book that talks about hiring specialists. Merchants are not mentioned in here, nor are sages. Sages are mentioned in here, but we're going to talk about the sage later. Sages are mentioned in this book as well. However, merchants are not. And it's interesting because the assassin is in here. So he lists those 3 character types of classes. Notably, he doesn't list the monk. So again, that's most people are thinking that the monk, developed by Brian Bloom, was put into this book called Blackmoor. Even though this is Dave Arneson's campaign, Dave Arneson doesn't list a monk as an available character class. But he does list assassin, merchant, and sage. So the assassin is in this book as a player character class. However, the sage shows up in the back as a specialist. And a lot of people believe that's because Dave Arneson provided his notes to Tim Kask, who was the editor on this book. And Tim's been very vocal that he had to really edit very hard what Dave gave him and redo it for publication. And so the theory is that Tim Kask moved the sage from PC status to NPC status because he didn't see it as a PC viable class. He also technically, from what I understand, didn't think the assassin made a good PC class, but he got overruled, so that was kept. And there is now supposition on 2 different camps. Some people think the merchant class was included in Dave's notes and that Tim Kask just excised it from the book completely. Another group of people say, no, it wasn't in there at all. So it's really hard to say one way or the other. Tim hasn't really talked too much about the merchant, so we're not really clear on whether he cut it out of the book or not. All we know is that the merchant is not in here. Okay, so the merchant, as far as making its first publication in the official D&D product, is going to be this book from 1977. This is the Monster Manual. So merchants show up in here as a type of men. So that's the monster type. And you see merchants in here listed as something that you can encounter. And there's, you can encounter between 50 to 300 of them. And then it tells you down here that basically 10% of the band of merchants will actually be tradesmen. 10% will be drovers, so driving sheep or cattle. And then the balance, 80%, are going to be mercenary guards. And then it goes on to tell you that for every number of people, there's a chance that you might have a magic user, a cleric, or a thief. So there's really, this is obviously not a class, it's a monster type, but it's kind of helping you kind of determine the world. It's world building as well, because knowing that merchants travel sometimes with magic users, clerics, and thieves gives you a little bit of insight into how that class might work. Okay, but that's the first publication that we see of a merchant in a D&D type publication. So where did this class come from? Well, it came from Dave Arneson's Blackmoor campaign, and Dave tells us in the front of the book where he's talking about setting up the town of Blackmoor. And he says that there was a character called the Merchant, that's the character's name, run by Dan Nicholson, and that he quickly became the local mafia. So he talks in here, and it comes up a couple times, and this has been corroborated by a man named Greg Svensson, and he played a character known as the Great Svenny in the Blackmoor campaign, and he corroborated this on a original Dungeons & Dragons forum that's dedicated to talking about Dave Arneson's Blackmoor. And he said, yes, Dan Nicholson played the Merchant, and he was opposed by Mello the Halfling and a character called the Blue Rider. And so what Dan Nicholson was doing as the Merchant was he was basically trying to take over all these different warehouses in the town of Blackmoor and all these different businesses. And so as the players began trying to go to different shops and buying equipment, more and more they would end up interacting eventually with Dan Nicholson's character. And they slowly started to realize like he's trying to control all the business in the town of Blackmoor. So while he's not an elected or appointed official, he's not like a mayor or anything like that, or a baron, whatever you want to call it. He was a merchant, and he's ending up becoming very powerful because of that. So that seems to be what his character's goal was. So remember, in the Blackmoor campaign, this is still based on war games where it is kind of player versus player. So different players have different goals. It's not cooperative. They're not going on adventures together. They are acting out the goals for their individual characters. And then they're also opposing each other if you have opposed goals, which is why you have those two characters of Mello the Halfling and you have the Blue Rider working together to oppose the merchant taking over all of the warehouses in the town, right? That's how the game was played. This does not describe anything about what a merchant's, abilities would be. So, this campaign setting doesn't have a traditional structure like we think. And it's because campaign settings really didn't exist back then the way we think of them now. So there's no details in here on how to play a merchant other than just telling you that there was one and what he was trying to do goal wise, but nothing about, an ability or anything like that, class abilities or levels or anything like that is not in here. Okay. So we know it's Dan Nicholson, and we know that he was playing this character. So we know this character exists from the list that's given in the back of this book in the special interest section. It appears that that character might have been played at least by 1975. Also, because this list does not include the Druid, which was published in the Eldritch Wizardry Supplement in 1976, we might think that that list was made before 1976. I don't have any proof of that because maybe Dave Arneson just didn't want Druids in his game and so left them off. You'll also notice if you saw that list earlier, he didn't include Thieves. And Thieves were an active class by this time. Thieves debuted in the same book as Paladins. And so he listed the Paladin as a character type, but not Thief. So it could just be that he was aware of the Druid and just didn't want it. So that could have been published later. But it seems like it was probably published at some point in that early 70s and maybe just post original Dungeons and Dragons having been published because of those character types having the fighters and magic users and clerics. So we know who was playing the class. We know when it was created roughly. And as far as the why, again, I really think it just comes down to that was the goal of that character. Now, whether Dan Nicholson created that goal for himself or whether it just kind of evolved naturally during the course of the campaign or whether he was maybe almost assigned or that goal is suggested to him by Dave Arneson, not really clear on that. So a lot of these games, like in the early Bronstein games, a lot of the players, Bronstein's the game that kind of came before, one of the games that came before Blackmoor. Blackmoor derives out of Bronstein. In a lot of the Bronstein games, Dave Weasley, who's running that game, would give goals to the characters. Like they would show up and he'd say, this is your character that you're playing and this is your goal. So I don't know if Dave Arneson gave that goal to Dan Nicholson or if he was just using it himself. Okay, but we've got a monster class of merchant. Well, it's not a class, but it's a monster, but we don't have a character class. So there are no character classes in this book. Dave Arneson by this point has left TSR. There is no merchant class in the player's handbook for advanced D&D. There's no merchant class or monster for a merchant in the Holmes basic set that comes out in 1977. Okay, so there's none of that. So the next kind of real place where we're going to see merchant as a potential for a class is in 1982. This was June of 1982, and this is an article written by Len Lakofka. So Len is an interesting fellow, important fellow in the history of early tabletop role-playing games. He lived in the Chicago area, and he was very involved with gaming with that Midwest area of war gamers. So he had met Gary Gygax and had played war games with him and was listed as, or was known to be one of the early playtesters of original Dungeons and Dragons before it was published. Okay, so we know that that Len had looked at that. And so it's very possible, being an early playtester, since original Dungeons and Dragons was created by Arneson and Gygax, and the merchant was part of Arneson's game, that maybe Len Lakofka had gamed with Arneson. I think it's we don't know, but I think it's very possible that he'd at least met him in person, probably discussed his game with him or read his notes. Whatever the case, he was an early playtester of the game. So we see this article written by him in the June 1982 issue of Dragon Magazine, Dragon number 62, and he talks about magic for merchants. And we're going to come back to this idea of magic and merchants because it's going to keep coming back over and over again. But he goes through this whole article and he talks about what merchants can do. And a lot of it involves being able to kind of stave off, people trying to swindle them or haggle them or anything like that, and being able to see through that, but also little cantrips and things that they can do to kind of like clean and repair and build things like that. So this is not a class. It's just a list of magic spells that are appropriate for merchant type characters, and the merchant being this one. And then it goes on to talk about like how many hit dice they would have. And pretty much everything he says matches what's in the monster manual. It's just kind of expanding on it and making it into like a bigger idea. Okay, so interestingly, merchants are mentioned in here. This is Empire of the Petal Throne. Going a little back and forth here, but this is 1975. And this is a game that was published by TSR, and it's based on the mechanics of D&D. And in this game, there are some original skills. And you see in the list of plebeian skills, you see merchant is listed down here. However, it's not described. What it says is most of the above listed skills are, probably self-explanatory. And so it never actually tells you what a merchant can do. It just tells you that that is a skill that you can have. So that's something that's as part of the history of this merchant idea. So we know that merchants are in this game. They're a monster and monster manual. And we see this article about using magic for merchants. Now, another thing that happens in the mid 80s is Dave Arneson writes a series of modules or adventures for TSR. This is the DA series or the Dave Arneson series. There were 4 of them. And in the series, he does talk about a lot of the different characters and NPCs. A lot of them are repeated from this book, but he talks about them in here. Interestingly, however, he leaves the merchant out of it. So he never actually explains the merchant in here. There is a section on NPCs in this book, and he talks about a lot of the famous ones, but he never mentions the merchant. So you see here, you've got, there's the Blue Rider, okay, that we talked about earlier. And there's the bishop, and there's Mello and the rest of the hobbits, but he doesn't talk about the merchant other than in that little section I showed you. Okay, so he writes this series of modules, and he doesn't mention the merchant. And in fact, merchants in this series of modules, the word barely comes up. It's mentioned here and there, but it's very rare. In fact, in the first one, I think it's only mentioned actually one time in the whole module. So Dave clearly isn't talking about merchants in those modules, okay? But then in 1988, you have in August of 88, Dragon Magazine number 136, you have another version of the merchant class written as an NPC class in Dragon Magazine number 136. Okay, so you see that article here. This is written by a man named Anthony Gleckler. And really, this class is not that dissimilar from what we were seeing Len Lakofka developing. It uses magic that's very specific to the types of things that a merchant should be able to do. So it does have some interesting things in it. They are known to be ex-adventurers. So that's part of the thing that starts to become common in all these sort of latter year editions of talking about the merchant, is a lot of them say that they are ex-adventurers, so they could have been another class before they became adventurer, or maybe they could multi-class. And they use D6 hit dice. You see they've got some interesting level titles here. These ones, they have magic, but they gain it by purchasing the spells from a merchant's guild. And they have an ability called an appraising, and it's very interesting. So this is 1988. This is only a year before second edition D&D is going to debut in 1989. And the appraising ability in this is very similar to what ends up being called the appraising non-weapon proficiency skill that shows up in second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So this is almost kind of like a preview of that, although, this article and the author were not involved in the development of second edition, but you start to see these ideas kind of coming together that are very similar. So that is Dragon Magazine number 136. And then we also have in 1989 the publication of one of the Gazetteers for the non-advanced Dungeons and Dragons line. This is Gazetteer 11, The Republic of Darokin. This is written by Scott Herring and William W. Connors. I actually talk with William all the time on Twitter. He's one of my Twitter friends. And so I was chatting with him a little bit about the creation of this, because this has a class in it known as a merchant class. And in this, you can see some pages from the document here, and it talks about how you become a merchant. And it's very similar. A lot of them are ex-adventurers, and they actually gain experience points separately for merchant experience than they get for their regular adventuring experience. So they're having to keep track of two different things of experience points. You've got your level titles here. Some of these are repeated from that article that we saw before. I don't think it's a copy. I just think there's only so many terms that make sense to use. I'm sure both of these guys got their thesauruses out and looked up, synonyms for merchants and used them in their tables. So these ones also have to be sponsored by merchant guilds. So again, kind of similar to the other class we saw, and the classes are very close time-wise to each other. So we're seeing these merchant classes, but just for whatever reason, interestingly, they all are relying on this idea of magic. So the question I asked Bill Connors was, do you know if the original merchant class that Dan Nicholson played in Blackmoor had magical abilities? Because I see Len Lakofka talk about it. And again, since Len Lakofka was a playtester of early Dungeons and Dragons, I do think that there's potential that he could have had some kind of interactions with Dave Arneson, maybe talked about this. Again, I'm just supposing here. I have no proof to back that up whatsoever. Just the timing of it and the location of where the people were all living at the time does seem to lend some, it's coincidental. We'll put it that way. And he basically what he said was, no, he doesn't actually have any memory of that whatsoever. Bill Connors told me this. And so I don't know that that's the reason, but I just thought it was interesting that every time you see the merchant popping up, it's got like these magical abilities to it. So Dave Arneson goes on to work with a company called Zeitgeist Games, and they publish some books on Dave Arneson's Blackmoor campaign under the D20 system. This is for 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons using the 3rd edition open game license. So there was Dave Arneson's Blackmoor campaign. That's the main book. It does have new character classes in here. Interestingly, none of the 4 of them are sages or merchants. However, there is a merchant class that appears in a follow-up publication called The Player's Guide to Blackmoor. And that class, it does not have magic. So it's a very skill-based class. It has high skill points, close to like what a bard would get in 3E, which was 6 per level, has a pretty detailed skill list. And all of the abilities are really mundane. They get a contact ability where they can purchase items that are available basically anywhere that they are, any kind of non-unique item that they might need. Up to a certain number of gold pieces per level they can purchase. And then they also get an ability to have items given to them at certain levels at a much lower GP level, but again, non-unique kind of mundane type items. And then they get these bonus feats, and the bonus feats are essentially just giving them skill focus to skills like craft or profession or I think knowledge was the other one. So that's kind of like what they get. It's not super exciting, really, but it does really lean heavily into the idea of the kinds of games that Dave Arneson ran. So again, those early Braunstein games that Blackmoor came out of, there was a lot of political maneuvering. Braunstein players were playing things like the mayor of the town or the regent or the chancellor of the university or the leader of the student revolution. So these kinds of political maneuverings, and a merchant type character that's trying to take over all of the trade in a town fits right into that. And it also, the merchant in Blackmoor had a lot of dealings with the Thieves Guild, and they were sometimes kind of at odds with each other over like who was going to control all of the trade in the town. So that kind of thing makes sense from Dave Arneson's standpoint. Doesn't necessarily make a great, going down into the dungeon adventuring type character, but it makes a great character for a game that's based on like political intrigue and things like that. So that's our quick history of the merchant. I know there's not a lot of detail there, but I'm kind of trying to go through all of the background material to sort of figure out like where could this class have come from and how could it have been played in one of the early games. So let's talk about the sage really quick. So again, we know the sage was listed in here. Now, the sage player, the earliest sage player, and I found this from a gentleman's blog. His name is Daniel Bogg, and he does a blog that's all about Blackmoor. He's commented on several of my history videos. So if you read through the comments, you're going to see him come through frequently, and which is awesome because he's super, knowledgeable about this kind of stuff. He's much more knowledgeable than I am on some of this early stuff. And he wrote a blog post about the Sage character and mentioned that I was Dave McGarry. That was the first character. So for the Sage, supposed that's the idea, is that it might have been him. Dave McGarry was playing a warrior fighter type character that through a series of circumstances ends up changing from a man to a woman in the game. There was like some kind of a change through, I think it was a polymorph spell, if I remember correctly. I'm going to put a link to this blog post below that you should go read that, because it's going to give you way more detail. And he ends up becoming like a scholar type character. They called it the scholaress. It's just a scholar. It just happens to be a woman, but could still use the fighter abilities that this character had gained earlier in the career. So it was like the scholar character that could wear armor and use weapons, which is kind of interesting. And so Daniel Boggs on his blog kind of says that like that looks like it might have been the model, at least for this Sage character, of not being the first Sage character. So he writes in there and gives you details of like how you could take that, make a Sage class based on what he thinks the Blackmoor Sage would have been. And he takes it from this book. So again, we've talked about how the Sage class shows up in this book, but it's put here in the specialist category. And it talks about all these things that a Sage can do. And it's actually detailed as though it's a player character class, even though it is a non-player character class in this book. So the idea is most people think that Tim Kask took Dave Arneson's Sage PC class and just made it an NPC because he didn't think it made sense. Okay. So just one kind of thing that's interesting in here is that it talks about all the abilities that a Sage can and can't do, or can and can't learn. If you look at the Sage that's in this book, the specialist that's detailed here, it says that Sages can only be hired by fighting men. So we're going to remember that for later. It says the Sage functions only advisory. They're employable only by fighting men or fighters. Okay. So the Sage next appears in an official D&D book in this book, the 1979 Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. And the Sage in here is detailed very much the same way that it is in the Blackmoor campaign book. However, it says right here, only fighters, paladins, ragers, thieves, and assassins are able to hire a Sage. So I think part of that was the idea that wizards and clerics are supposed to kind of be knowledgeable and have areas of knowledge expertise anyway. So the fighter types can hire them because they don't have that knowledge. I guess that was the idea. I'm not really clear on, why you're limiting who can hire a Sage. There's really no mechanical reason for that. It's kind of just comes down to world building, but it doesn't really make sense. Like, is a Sage going to turn down money just because it's a magic user trying to hire him? Doesn't really make sense. But that's kind of a little bit on the Sage. So that one is a little bit easier to kind of parse to get through. So we kind of know who this first Sage is. We see them show up as non-player characters. So it seems pretty clear that Dave might have used it. Dave Arneson might have used it in his game as a player character class as opposed to a non-player character class. Sages don't appear as in detail in the DA series of modules that we talked about earlier, that were written for the non-advanced version of D&D in the mid-'80s. And they do not show up as character classes in, the later D20 era Blackmoor books that Dave Arneson wrote in conjunction with Zeitgeist Games. But they've been around in the game. Now, Sages are still around, as are merchants in the D&D Player's Handbook for 5th edition. So they are as backgrounds in here. And most of you would already know this if you play 5th edition. But there is a Sage background, and there is a background for a guild artisan, but then there's a variant called a guild merchant. And it talks, so that's your merchant background. And then here's your Sage background right here. So they kind of exist not as player character classes, but I think it's kind of fun that in 5th edition, still has stuff that goes back to the roots of like this kind of pre-D&D stuff, Dave Arneson's campaign, and how he wanted to play a campaign having these sort of more political intrigue characters versus, just warrior types bashing each other with swords. Okay, but I think for me, a more fun way to play a merchant right now, or get ideas for merchants, going to come from this book. So I just recently did a short where I unboxed this. I probably am going to do a full review on this soon, but I wanted to talk about merchants because they show up in this book So here's your 2 pages on merchants. And what this book does is give you these ideas on their appearance, their voice, their wants, their morality, their intelligence. So what a DM could use immediately if you come across a merchant in a game and you didn't have an NPC ready, this is going to give you everything you need to know about how to play them, what they're looking for, what kind of treasure they have, why is the merchant in the dungeon, what kind of pack animals do they use, how far or, are they away from or on the way to their destination, a quirk, a secret wealth, where their secret wealth is stored, what kind of haggling things are going to happen as far as getting a price, increase or decrease, what a mission they might assign to a party. And then you've got D100 merchants, names, and what kind of cargo they have. This is great stuff. This is so much more flavorful than a lot of the stuff that you see in official, stuff coming out from Wizards of the Coast these days, and something that a DM can use right at the table to run now. So for me, I also did some versions of a merchant and a sage for a book that I'm working on. You just see a quick part of my table here. This is an expert and specialist book that I've been working on for Old School Essentials, which is a BX D&D clone. And I'm basically just making these as sort of like tweaks to existing character classes. So the sage is just a tweak to a magic user, just making a few changes here and there. And then the merchant, same thing. The merchant is just a tweaked thief, essentially. So I kind of like that approach to characters as opposed to making a whole merchant class or a whole sage class, just take an existing class and role play it with just a few minor modifications. So that book is probably going to be coming out later. The layout's pretty much done. I just need to kind of, go through it, edit it, and then eventually I'll be doing a Kickstarter for that book later this year. So that's our look at merchants and sages. Again, I would love to hear from you in the comments if you've played a merchant or sage character, or if you have any information, if you're an old-time gamer. Hopefully Daniel Boggs will see this and leave a comment and add some extra details to this so that we can get some more information. But this is the information that I had. So with that, I would like to say thank you again very, very much for watching. Happy gaming, stay safe, and I'll talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content of the video, what I was drinking and what I was listening to while I was prepping my notes for this particular video. So drinking wise, I was having a little bit of this. This is NIKKA Coffee Green Whiskey. So this is a Japanese whiskey from the NIKKA whiskey distillery. And so it's called coffee green. So a lot of people get confused and are like, whiskey that tastes like coffee. No, obviously it's spelled differently, which a lot of people don't pay attention to. So this is named after the gentleman who created the coffee still. He's from Scotland. And people from Japan went to Scotland when they were learning how to make whiskey or deciding that they wanted to learn to make whiskey. And they brought one of his stills back. It's a column type still. So that's really all that this means. It doesn't even really need to be on here because pretty much most whiskey in Japan is made in these types of stills, but it just kind of sounds kind of exotic to people. So it's more of a marketing technique than anything else, but it is made in a coffee still. So this is grain whiskey. It's made in the Scotch style, just doesn't have that like kind of smoky, bits that you would get from having like the smoked peat as part of the process. So I just had a little nip here. I really like it. It's very smooth. It's a little caramely, and even a little bit fruity maybe. Listening wise, I was listening to this. This is a brand new record that just came out a couple weeks ago. Evenings at the Village Gate with John Coltrane and Eric Dolphy. So you've got this nice gatefold. So this is originally recorded in 1961, a concert with the two of them. And this is produced by Robbie Coltrane, so John Coltrane's son. I had the pleasure of seeing Robbie Coltrane perform at the Blue Note in New York pre-pandemic. It was a great show. So some really fun songs on here, a 15, almost 16-minute version of My Favorite Things. Interestingly, Eric Dolphy plays flute on that song. So not a lot of jazz flute. If you've seen Anchorman, I'm sure you're making a joke in your head right now, but it's a great version of that song. Great record. I was able to pick this up at my friend's record shop that he owns in Burbank, California. And that's it. Thank you again for watching.